Shalom, good afternoon from Jerusalem, Israel. Welcome to episode 2 of our monthly Root and Branch Association Lost Tribes Fellowship seminars, hosted by Fellowship Chairman Yair Davidiy, who is known for years as the founder of Brit-Am and Hebrew Nations, the two websites where you can see his massive documentation, many books, hundreds of essays, articles that he's been working on for, 40 years?
Yeah, a long time, man.
A long time. Well, considering we're dealing with the phenomenon of reuniting the family after 2,600 years, what's 40 years? A long time, relative term. So,
a long time for me.
Well, in my
for mortal
lifetime,
man, for mortal
agreed.
beings, it's a long time.
I agree. I'm 65 years young, and 40 years would be a lot of my 65. So, this is Lowell Joseph Gallin, founder of the Root and Branch Association Limited, established in New York State, in God of Israel, Bless America, in 1981, and now celebrating our 40th anniversary, 1981 through 2021, 40 years young. We welcome our viewers and listeners worldwide to today's episode in our Root and Branch Association Limited English Language Conference and Lecture Series, established in Jerusalem, Israel in January 1995. And now celebrating the conclusion of our first quarter century from 1995 to 2020, and the start of our second quarter century, 26 years young. Actually, in a few weeks, we're finishing the 26th year, the first year of the second quarter century. We are broadcasting from the land of Israel, city of God, Jerusalem, hill of the priests, Ivat Hanani Abu Tur, overlooking Mount Moriah, where we of traditional Israelite faith believe that the third and final Israelite temple of Jerusalem will soon be under reconstruction and stand forever as per the prophet Ezekiel. Please see the biblical book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48. Today in the Gregorian calendar is Monday, November 1st, 2021. In the Hebrew Israelite calendar, it is the 26th day of the 8th month of the new Hebrew Israelite year of 5782. I have to add a footnote there. We have 4 new years, at least. Maybe there's more. The new year, the Shemitah sabbatical year, which began 2 months ago in the beginning of the 7th month, Rosh Hashanah is 5782. So why is it the 8th month? Because we begin counting the months with the first month that the children of Israel went out from Egypt. Actually, we're still going out. A person should always view ourselves going out every day. And that was the month that's known as Nisan, usually in March or April. Rosh Chodesh Nisan was the first day of the first month. So it's actually the 26th day of the 8th month. And this ancient Israelite autist believes that we are in the 232nd day of the second year of the renewing 5th Israelite monarchy of Daniel's vision. Please see the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 44. Having said that, as an introduction, and now hand the program over to Yair Davidiy, who will give us another illuminating and enlightening lecture on the lost tribes of Israel. Yair, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. So we represent Brit-Am, Hebrew awareness, as it was said, and we work out of the land of Israel, and we have been going at this for quite a while. And we have a lot of people who follow us who are interested in the subject, but not enough. We fight. We're always struggling to get more people aware of it. and to interest people, because this is an important subject. This is an important subject, and we believe in it, and it proves itself. We got ongoing research, constantly reinforces our initial conclusions. New factors, new facts, new proofs, some additional evidence daily or very frequently comes streaming in, and all helps to confirm the overall conclusion, the overall understanding concerning the lost 10 tribes. So originally, you had 12 tribes of Israel. You had 12 tribes of Israel. And the 12 tribes of Israel were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob was renamed Israel. The name of Jacob had his name changed to Israel. And he was a forefather of the tribes of Israel, 12 tribes of Israel. And of these 12 tribes of Israel, Judah was one of the most important, whereas Joseph was also important. And eventually the Judah became predominant amongst in the south, whereas Joseph became paramount in the north. And we had the kings. We had King Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. After King Saul, we had David. After David, we had Solomon. After Solomon, we had Rehoboam. In the time of Rehoboam, 10 of the northern tribes separated. They seceded. They set up their own kingdom in the north, known as the Kingdom of Israel, or sometimes known as Samaria, after what was at a later stage was his main province. Also referred to occasionally in the prophets as Ephraim or as House of Joseph. At all events, this 10 northern kingdom of Israel, as it is also referred to, was separated from Judah and had its own arrangements, its own type of religious practices. They worshipped pagan idols, or they worshipped the God of Israel together with pagan idols. They adopted pagan influences, and because of that, they were eventually exiled, as the Bible tells us in the second book of Kings, chapter 17, in great detail, that they went in the ways of the peoples around them. Because of that, the Assyrians came down and conquered them and exiled them and took them away. Whereas in the south, the southern kingdom of Judah remained. In the south, the southern kingdom of Judah was centered around Jerusalem. It comprised the tribe of Judah, together with the tribe of Benjamin, and Benjamin and Judah, they shared the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the capital of this entity. Remained. Jerusalem and the temple remained in the center of the kingdom of Judah, and Jerusalem is in effect was on the border, straddled the border between Judah and Benjamin. They both shared the city of Jerusalem. This is what held them together, one of the factors that held them together. And they both basically remained faithful to the laws of Moses. They too, here and there, as we find in the Bible, they went astray now and again. They worshipped idols, but they always came back and they remained on track. And they continued to develop what we now know as Judaism, and they were recognizable. Whereas the 10 tribes had been taken away by the Assyrians, they're taken away to different sections of the Assyrian Empire. Some of them had been taken overland, most of them probably been taken overland to the northern areas of Syria, the foothills of the Caucasian Mountains, to what is now eastern Iraq, western Iran, even in all that area. All that area was a part of the Assyrian Empire. And from there, eventually they moved to the north. They went beyond the Caucasus Mountains. They went to the north. They went to southern Russia. They affiliated with other peoples, became part of different confederations, known to history as the Chimerids, the Scythians, the Goths. The 10 tribes were part of them. In some cases, they dominated them. In other cases, they were affiliated confederate tribes with them. And together they moved to the west and eventually converged in Western Europe. At the same time, there was also a movement across the sea. The Assyrians had a world empire, and the Assyrians were attempted to establish colonies overseas to supply them with raw materials. It was a Bronze Age. They needed tin and copper for their bronze. They needed agricultural products. They needed a lot of goods that were not available or ceased to be available in the home country. So they established colonies overseas, which were actually run by Philistines and Phoenicians from Tyre, Philistines from the south of Israel, Philistines who were part of the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations of Greece. And they established colonies overseas in Spain, in Britain and Scandinavia. And there too, Israelites were taken to work as slave labor, or in some cases as slave labor. They worked in quarries and they worked in mines, also as simple colonists. They established agricultural enterprises in Spain to supply the Syrian Empire. And elsewhere, they were a part of the ongoing attempt by the Syrians to expand their empire. It didn't last very long. Eventually, the Syrian Empire was defeated by its enemies, also defeated by Israelites who rebelled against it. It was destroyed. So these Israelites were out there, and they eventually also asserted their independence and asserted their own independent entities. And they split, they divided up, but they moved. We can trace their movements, we can trace their developments and see how they all moved and converged in the same areas and began to populate the areas of Western Europe. And one of the tribes, one of the most fascinating tribes and interesting tribes, perhaps one of the most important tribes, was the tribe of Dan. And the tribe of Dan, even before the exile, had begun to establish a presence overseas. The prophetess Deborah was one of the judges in the time of first Israelites when they came into the land of Israel. The Israelites came out of Egypt. They moved through the desert. Then after 40 years in the wilderness, they began to conquer the land under Joshua. Joshua led the invasion. Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim. And they conquered the land and divided it up amongst the different tribes. And then there was a long period of judges when the Israelites were ruled by judges. So one of these judges was a woman called Deborah. Deborah was a prophetess. She was very important. She was a prophetess. She judged the people of Israel. She was the wife of Lapidot. She herself was possibly from one of the northern tribes. And she, together with Barak from the tribe of Naphtali, she fought a war against the Canaanites in the north. And even though she herself was more in the center around the region of Ramah, and at all events, they were successful in their war, and she sang or uttered a song of triumph after the victory. And in this song, she says, why did Dan live in ships? Dan even then was known as living in ships. We find different sections of the tribe of Dan. We find Dan in the north. We find Dan initially received this area to the south in the southeast of Israel, what is now Tel Aviv and Jaffa. Even now in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, this area is known as Gush Dan. Gush Dan, meaning the area of Dan. That's even today. And that was the initial area that was given to the tribe of Dan. But the Bible tells us above in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges tells us how this area was too small for them. And they went out from it. And there were different accounts. And one account in the book of Joshua says how they went out and they conquered an area known as Leshem. And they renamed it after Dan, their father. And then we find again in the book of Judges a similar story, how they went out from this area in the southeast of Israel, bordering on Judah, and they went to the north and they conquered a place called Luash, and they renamed it after Dan, their father. And there are commentators who say Leshem and Luash are different forms or different versions of variants on the same name, referring to the same place. And they're describing the same event. But when you go into it deeply, we find that is not so. That Eliash was actually a place referred to in books on archaeology and books on ancient history of that time as Luash. That is how its name is commonly transliterated, but it could just as easily have been Laish, as the Bible gives it. And in this area, a people known as the Danana, as the people of Dan, set up a kingdom known as Small, and they had their own entity around that area in southeast Turkey. It was otherwise known as Kilikia, and they were also neighbored by a conclave, a body of settlers from Judah, known as Yadi. And there were also other tribes from Benjamin, Yamini, Yadam, and from Gad, from the tribe of Gad. Also in that area, there were Israelites up there in that area. The tribe, the initial, the impression is that when the Israelites came into the land of Israel, they had been promised that all of the area of the land, all of the promised land would belong to them. And then the Bible tells us several times in the book of Joshua showed that everything that had been promised to them had come to pass. But subsequent history does not necessarily confirm this. Nevertheless, the impression is that indeed they did conquer all of the area that had been promised them, from the Nile to the Euphrates and further to the north. But they didn't settle in all of it. They only settled in select regions, and they lost control over good portions of it very quickly. But they had been there. So the Israelites were, and those who they had been there. In some cases, they had been separated from the rest of the body of Israel, but they were there, and they established a kingdom known as the Small Kingdom of the Dananu. They conquered Cyprus. They conquered additional islands. According to Greek legends, at one stage they also conquered Greece, and they exerted an important influence on early Greek civilization, the Mycenaean civilization. There's a book called Black Athenia, which is quite impressive, and he argues that the ancient Greeks were heavily influenced by Semitic elements, possibly Israelites, and he brings quite a lot of evidence in that direction. So this is important. It's worth knowing about, but it's not the main thing that we can take it or leave it. We tend to believe that such was the case, but even if it wasn't the case, our main emphasis is on identifying specific peoples with Israelite tribes. We find descendants of Dan in Denmark, and also in Ireland, and also in England, what is now known as England. And the people of Denmark, there were people, part of the peoples of Scandinavia. There were peoples in Scandinavia from the earliest times. You look it up in the encyclopedia, you'll find for tens of thousands of years there were peoples up in that region. Now we actually don't accept the modern interpretations and the dates, but even if you do, it doesn't really matter. The mass, the major body of the Danish population only reached the area at first in the Bronze Age and after about 500 BCE, and then the majority of them came much later, around 300 to 500 CE, about 1,000 years later, and relatively recently, and they settled in Denmark. And they had a tradition that their forefather was Dan. Dan was the name of their forefather. The name of the Dans, the name Denmark. Denmark means the border of Dan. And when they say that the Angles were also their brothers, with their kith and kin, were brother tribes to them. The Angles settled in England and gave the name England to England. And that they say that also the Jutes were with them, and there's a tradition that the Danes are descended from Dan, the Jutes were descended from Judah. And also, even when they were still in the land of Israel, the tribe of Dan and Judah were neighboring each other in the south. According to the Midrash, Samson, the hero of Dan, he had a Jewish mother from Jewish, and a father from Dan. And and in continuation of that tradition, there's a version that says that the future Messiah will have a mother from Dan and a father from Judah. In other words, he will have some reflection of what the physical constitutions that went into the making of Samson. Samson, in a sense, was even a forerunner of the future Messiah in some ways. So there we have a connection from the beginning between Dan and Judah. Also in the Dadanu, who settled in southeast Turkey, there was an enclave from Judah besides them, an independent enclave that occasionally there were two parties were ruled by the same king, by the same dynasty. At other times they were independent of each other, but they were there. And Yadi is another way of saying Judah in that region. In other words, they call themselves Yadi. So to the Judes or Utah in northern dialects is another way of saying Jews, another word for Jew. So the Judes have their name actually called Judes, and they had a tradition that they descended from Judah, and they were amongst the early settlers of Denmark. The Judes left, a good portion of the Judes left Denmark and got together with the Angles and Saxons who were invading England, and they went with them, and they settled mainly in the south of England, and they're still there now. Whereas the Danes of Denmark took over the area of Jutland, and also other islands around it and beside it. Also, for a while, they were living in the south of Sweden, and all that region. We find people from Denmark, people are associated with the Danes, and the Danes according to their own tradition, some legends say they were descended from Israel. Others say their forefather was named Humble. That was the name of their father, the father of the Danes and the Angles, Humble. Humble is actually another term or another understanding of the name Yaakov. Yaakov, when he was born, he grabbed hold of the heel of Achav, and it was dragged out of the room, hanging on to this heel. Therefore, he is called Yaakov. After that, Yaakov in Hebrew can also mean to take over, to grab hold of, and to more or less take overtake on the ways of to say. If you're driving on the road and your car goes around another car, it's okevota, Yaakov. So it can overtake, it can trick. There's another connotation of the name Yaakov, and another connotation of it is humility, because the angle is the lowest portion of the body, and so this was a name that they attached, that they ascribed to their forefather, which could be understood to say that they were saying that their forefather was named Yaakov. At all events, that is where we find descendants of Denmark, the descendants of the Danes in Denmark, and they have attributes similar to those of the Danes that were known in ancient times as being the strongest of all peoples in the north. They're similar to Samson. They were warriors, as described as the tribe of Dan was. They were foremost amongst the Vikings who established settlements in England and France and in Ireland. And so too, they had have an egalitarian outlook on life, similar to what Dan is commonly ascribed. We also find elements from Dan who settled in Ireland.